Hello, we are live on University Radio Nottingham. I'm Felix Hawes, and this is The Big Picture and the last one of the academic year. Joining us today we have Titus.
Hello there.
Aaron.
Hey, what's up, Felix?
And Rebecca.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. So today we will be talking about the vote of confidence in Boris Johnson, which happened on Monday. We'll be talking about the cost of living crisis and the ongoing war in Ukraine, which of course has actually led to The Big Picture to be banned in Russia over a previous episode, so that's a label for us. Okay, well, let's start with the vote of confidence in Boris Johnson. So on Monday of this week, Boris Johnson reached the threshold of the letters that are submitted to the backbench committee for the Conservatives, called the 1922 committee. And it's believed that this was reached at some point last week, but they held off because of the Jubilee. Boris won the vote of confidence, but it was actually not that much of a convincing victory. It was only, I believe, 59 to 41%. So there's quite a significant amount of backbenchers that don't support him, and they come from across the broad church of the Conservative Party, with Brexiteers like Steve Baker and Remainers like Stephen Hammond wanting him to go, lockdown skeptics like Mike Harper, and lockdown hawks like Jeremy Hunt, and the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, also has double U-turned and is also still now again calling Boris Johnson to resign. But with the leadership rules as they stand, he can remain on for another year or so, although there have been talks for that to also change. Okay, we've had some Message the Show, which is a new feature that we discovered. Daniel is listening, and he is saying God save the Queen. Steve Baker, what a legend, we've also had here. And for your information, Titus will answer that John Major would... what would John Major do about the cost of living crisis? That is something that Daniel wants to know from you, Titus. Okay, but first of all, back to the confidence vote. What do you three make of this?
That's it. I know Jacob Rees-Mogg said that they only needed a simple majority to win the confidence vote, which of course he's right, but surely the Prime Minister and the Cabinet must be feeling uncomfortable about the confidence vote, especially seeing not just the numbers, but as you mentioned, like as you touched on earlier, just such a broad in terms of the ideologies of those Conservative members, such a broad church within the Conservative Party that have opposed his leadership. So regardless of what they say in public, surely he must be feeling pretty uncomfortable about this. Though saying that, I don't see... the Prime Minister isn't going to resign, right? So I don't see which other mechanisms, outside of changing the rules of confidence votes, I don't see him resigning. Good.
I do find that interesting, because I it seems like that's the case, that he's someone who wouldn't resign. I think he wouldn't resign over Partygate, but I think you look at someone like Theresa May. She had a confidence vote, and she won that, but then 6 months later her authority was shot. Ministers had resigned. A lot of ministers resigned from Theresa May's government, not all at once, but over the time. And so I think that he won't resign for a personal failing. And that is clear. He's never going to do that. But there does become a case where his leadership is untenable and he has no authority. And I do think, in that case, would resign. In order to get to that place, we'd need ministerial resignations. So I think the point where Boris Johnson resigns, which I do think is the most likely outcome, I don't think that he could still take them into the next election, but I don't think that's most likely. But I think when ministers start jumping ship, I think that the Prime Minister would really be in a lot of trouble then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Boris Johnson, because of the way he just runs the way he is Prime Minister, I think he'll have to be forced out. I don't think he's going to resign anytime soon. The question is whether or not he gets enough support. I mean, we've got people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's come under fire because of obviously things he said about Theresa May, but I think I don't think he's going to resign, certainly not with any kind of integrity anytime soon, but whether or not he'll eventually be forced out, I mean, I think that's a possibility, that he might resign from just sort of internal pressure. I think only time will tell.
It is certainly very interesting when you talked earlier, Titus, about resignations, because we've had some junior resignations, junior ministers resigning, such as John Lamont. I think there's been about 2 or 3 that have resigned.
Jesse Norman,
and who of course his wife was significant in was it Track and Trace was his wife, I think, who ran that, or possibly something else. I apologise if I've got that wrong. But no heavyweights, no one from the actual main cabinet has resigned. They all seem to be, at least in public, faithful to their leader. Do you think we're going to see anyone from the cabinet actually resign? And if so, what could they possibly resign over if they haven't resigned already?
I think that the Tiverton and Honiton by-election will certainly not be a decisive factor, but it will be an indication of which way this is going to go for members of the cabinet, I think, or just ministers of significance. I think if they see a Lib Dem victory there and a Labour victory in Wakefield, that's the other by-election, I think they will know that this is not the writing's on the wall for Boris. I think it would take something further, but it seems with Boris that a scandal is never too far away. So they probably wouldn't need to make up a sob story about why they have to go. And I think once a couple go, then the balloon is going to deflate fairly quickly.
But is it not normally the case that governments will lose by-elections, and it is the case that the Conservative Party have already lost seats like North Shropshire, which should not really be turning any other colour than blue with their track record? It does look to be the case that at least Wakefield is likely to go Labour. The Blue Wall seat that you mentioned there could turn Liberal Democrat. I mean, that would be overturning a huge majority, of which the number escapes me, but I know it's significantly large. 24,000. I mean, that would be a very significant blow for Boris Johnson. But do you think actually that the fact that Boris seems to go from scandal to scandal to scandal, before recently it didn't really stick, now it is, do you think actually anything could be a catalyst, or do you think cabinet ministers are now sort of immune to this, and that Boris Johnson can just keep going?
I do think ministers have become, to some extent, I mean, in addition to the general public, in fairness, I think there's people have become quite desensitized to these scandals. I mean, you think, like, if, say for example, more pictures from these parties were released, today, for example, I think most people would sort of shrug, like, be a bit disappointed, but I think most people would sort of shrug their shoulders compared to 6 months ago, where people would be horrified, even at hearing about these parties. But with regards to ministers, I think a lot of ministers are quite hesitant, especially to be the first, although I do think the floodgates could open if a few people resigned. I do think a lot of ministers are very reluctant to show any sort of, like, what might be called disloyalty. Like, not only just for Boris, but, with regards to their prospect of getting into any future cabinet. I don't think anybody wants to be, the first person to break form, if you will.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, it's fine.
So I was just gonna say that your point about the public being weary of Partygate and these stories, I think they may be weary of it, but it doesn't seem like Boris's numbers are recovering too much. And I think the danger with these two by-elections is that they're in very different locations and a very different profile of voter. So if they lose both sort of maybe slightly socially conservative working class voters in the north, and also slightly more rural, soft Tory, lifelong conservatives in the south, then it shows that their appeal is not about it's widespread. Their loss of appeal is widespread. It's not just a certain group has been turned off. They are in a lot of trouble, and it's hard to know where they then start to gather that back. It shows that it's not just a policy, but it's maybe more an issue of trust.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a point to be said that, like, in any other, I think this has been a point that lots of people have reiterated, which is that if it was any other prime minister, obviously we would have seen them resign by now. So, I mean, maybe, Boris Johnson has hung on for so long because he wasn't elected with integrity in the first place. That wasn't what was kind of different about him. They just liked him as a person. I think that kind of appeal has now really waned with the public. So I think, public response to a certain extent is important, but I also think cabinet ministers and things have just become tired of the scandals and the lack of I think people have lost respect a bit for the Conservative Party because of Boris's actions directly, and I think that can kind of only go on for some time without, cabinet ministers just getting fed up and wanting there to be, just more respect and general integrity within the party itself.
You raise a good point there, because Boris Johnson surviving his confidence vote on Monday will now appear to the general public that this isn't a Boris problem but a Conservative problem because they supported him. And the thing is, Partygate's not going to go away because we're going to have the Privileges Committee also giving their report, I believe that's their name, apologies if it isn't, that are investigating whether or not Boris Johnson misled the House, of which it appears perhaps he did, although he could get around it by saying that he thought that all laws were following and that he didn't know his own laws that he made. But this isn't going to go away, and although it is possible, as was mentioned, that people will just... It won't. If people aren't annoyed already, they're unlikely to become annoyed if they aren't already with more things. But who knows what's going to keep going with Boris Johnson? Do you think that his actions are going to rip the Conservative Party apart? Because the Welsh Conservatives have, it's been leaked recently, are thinking about splitting from their English counterparts, and this has already been mooted as an idea for the Scottish Conservatives as well. Do you think this is something that's likely to happen, or do you think this is a bit of an overreaction, bearing in mind the Conservative Party has been at each other's throats before, in fact, to be honest, perhaps most of the time? So, what do you think about that?
I mean, we don't usually see... we see plenty of division within the Conservative Party, of course, but, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, most Conservative Prime Ministers, they would have resigned by now, so to some extent we're in kind of unprecedented territory. So, it may be... I'm not really sure. Maybe it just depends how long Boris sticks around for. If the division continues for a certain amount of time, I really feel like we're in unprecedented territory at this point, because it's no longer sort of short-term divisions. They seem to be more entrenched over time. I think the longer we go, the more entrenched those divisions will be.
I do think though that the like you say, the Conservative Party have had a lot of issues in the past. They still do, over Europe. And I don't think this will necessarily be the death knell of a sort of union-wide party. But it will be interesting to see which way the Northern Irish border question falls. I think that could potentially be the scandal that keeps Boris, that ends Boris's premiership, as it will put further pressure on the party and cause further divisions when there's already issues. I see the prospect of Scottish and Welsh Tories going their own ways as not especially likely. Because they still carry that Conservative brand, they will still be associated in several ways.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll probably see more kind of splintering and more Conservative MPs taking their own stance and separating themselves from Parliament, particularly from Boris, specifically. Particularly as well if you're geographically quite far from London. I feel like you can probably have more of a personal basis with your constituency, maybe. And if you're in Wales or Northern Ireland, you can kind of separate yourself a bit more. I think the Northern Ireland issue is definitely going to be a massive problem for Boris, and we've already seen him try to do his best in defending his decisions at the time. I think whenever it comes to anything with Brexit, it's just really hard to do that. So I think that is going to be something that's a further problem.
Well, it's going to be interesting times ahead, isn't it? And it's even the case possibly the case that they'll alter the rules to get rid of Boris Johnson. These are the rebels, because it was suggested when Theresa May survived her vote back in 2018 that they were going to change the rules that you could be challenged within 6 months. And there was also an old party rule that Jacob Rees-Mogg discovered that didn't get enacted last time with Theresa May because she was gone before I suppose they could do this, which is where there's another way of getting rid of submitting a lack of confidence, I should say, in the leader of the Conservative Party by getting chairs of local party constituencies to submit letters. Now, this is not binding. It wouldn't get rid of the leader, but it'd be quite symbolic. Do you think the sort of old rules that were uncovered by the European research group to try and get rid of Theresa May could be used to get rid of Boris? Or do you think the rebels will reluctantly accept the fact that Boris Johnson will remain in office and perhaps try again within a year? After a year, rather.
I think something that is notable and that was touched on earlier about the rebels was they're not a clear faction. They're not a singularly ideological driven group. The group that opposed Mrs May was you could certainly see it was headed by the ERG and Eurosceptics. But this one is from all over, and I think that also speaks to another big concern with Johnson's leadership, especially from Conservatives, people who are not part of the party. Obviously, they see his sort of lying, his lack of integrity, his sort of the personal morals being of low importance to him. But for Conservatives, I think they see this government as rudderless and directionless and without any conservative ideology. It flip-flops depending on where public opinion is. You look at the windfall tax on the big oil and plenty of other policies they've sort of moved about on, not really had any idea about what they want to do. And they haven't been sufficiently sort of Thatcherite neoliberal for right-wingers, and they obviously haven't pleased more left-wing people who dislike Boris's style and personality. So if you go into the Telegraph, you'll see lots and lots of people criticising, yes, the parties, but mostly the lack of conservatism, but also just lack of clear ideas about what the country should be like, and lack of policies. I think Jesse Norman touched on it, and I think that is a big concern that people like to talk about less, because parties are sort of fun and it's sort of exciting. It's a scandal, breaking rules.
Anything to add, Aaron and Rebecca?
I mean, I'd say that one thing that works in their favour at the moment, you could definitely argue that maybe the Conservative Party is struggling with a bit of their direction. But I'd also say the Labour Party is quite directionless at the moment, and that's kind of a major criticism, is that they're doing an okay job in sort of arguing against the opposition, and responding to the scandals and things like that. But I wouldn't say that their policies are particularly strong at the moment, and they don't seem to have cohesion in the party. So maybe that's something, relatively speaking, comparing that to the Conservative Party, while we are seeing obviously a lot of division over the scandals, if that was potentially something which was somehow resolved, then I think they would be potentially in a stronger position in that sense. So I mean, I guess it's kind of relative to a certain extent.
I agree that the criticism extends to the Labour Party also, but I think the criticism is a bit less harsh when you're talking about a party which isn't in power. Like when you're talking about the Conservative Party, which obviously has been in power for quite some time now. 12. That's actually.
Yeah, I mean it's a good, very good point. The Conservative Party have been in office for 12 years, and Labour are still trying to find their ground in how they're going to try and get back into office. Well, before I go into our first song, I want to read some messages we've received in from some of our listeners from Tenerife. So we actually are now going global. Obviously, it wouldn't be Russia because we're banned there. So we've got Sarah listening as well. Sarah's listening. You've 7 new listeners from Tenerife. Rob is telling me here. Sarah is saying that she's the most regular guest, which is true, and Daniel says that she's also the most nonsensical guest. Is what Daniel is saying. Also, we've had a comment that Titus is whittering on about Northern Ireland, rolling eyes. I can imagine that's from Daniel. Okay, well, I think that's been a good first part of the show. Our first song of today is actually a request from our most regular listener, who is Ella. And Ella has been listening almost every week when she can, and she has requested a song, which we'll now play. So enjoy. Welcome back to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham. Before we move on to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, or war in Ukraine, let's have a look at some more of our messages. Well, Felix's dad, that's me, is listening from Wycombe, the United Kingdom. Ella thanks us for the song, and I do agree with her that was a great choice, and so does Isabel, who's loving this from Tenerife. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. Please do keep commenting on the show. I'm enjoying reading them. Okay, The Ukraine crisis, we've talked about this before on the radio. Of course, our Russian listeners wouldn't know that, but we have been talking about the war in Ukraine. I think Aaron was telling me before we went on air that when he first came on The Big Picture, this was actually a new war that's been going on for a long time. Now, since we've talked about this last, Russia have changed their plans, or at least they've said it's always been the case that they were not actually aiming for all of Ukraine, but just the east. And it seems that the war is sort of, I would say, almost at a stalemate, because at 1 minute Russia takes a city, then Ukraine take it back, or Ukraine take back pieces of land elsewhere on the east of Ukraine. So it's a bit of a stalemate. The Western world is still supporting them, although we're not hearing about it as much in the press now, obviously, because it's not new content, I suppose, so it's the media have sort of left it a little bit. But we have had some interesting comments from people like President Macron, who's been saying we shouldn't be humiliating Russia, which has annoyed Ukraine. Boris Johnson remains very popular in Ukraine. I think he probably would wish that he was as popular there as he is here, with President Zelensky saying that he thought it was great news that Boris Johnson survived the vote of confidence earlier this week. Is this war going to end anytime soon, or is this something we'll be talking about on The Big Picture for a long time, and the suffering of the Ukrainian citizens and the Russian people is going to continue for a long time to come? What do you reckon?
Unfortunately, I don't see it ending anytime soon, but I do want to say that the performance of Ukraine and regular Ukrainians, like former plumbers and accountants in this war, has been like nothing short of extraordinary. They've been absolutely incredible. As you say, Russia has changed their tactics. Before went for sort of quick, mechanized sort of blitzkrieg tactics, which obviously haven't worked. So they've gone back to their sort of tried and tested strategy of, leveling cities basically and marching forward. But yeah, unfortunately, I see it being a stalemate for quite a while. But also, I was expecting Russia to win the war quite quickly. So compared to how I felt the last time I was on here, it seems much more positive for Ukraine than it did at that time, at least in my mind.
Titus?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the war doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. It seems like it'd be at least a year, I would say. But again, it's hard to make pronouncements on this when you're very far away and you have sort of limited access to information, primarily from sort of newspapers and sort of statements by politicians who obviously have lots of other interests there. But it does seem like Ukraine are effective enough and have a strong enough army to maintain what they have, but maybe don't have the heavy weaponry to launch an effective counter-attack to completely push Russia out. And it also looks like Ukraine wouldn't accept a peace where Crimea or the Donbass stay with Russia. So it does look like they will be in a conflict for a bit longer. Maybe it would end with those weapons being given to Ukraine by America or Britain or Germany, or potentially some instability in Russia. But it's again, it feels like that might be slightly further away, and it's quite hard to say anything for certain.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really hard to speculate. I'm not like a war strategist. I don't know how long it's going to continue for. But I think one thing that is really good is the fact that it has taken Russia much longer, I think, than they thought. And Ukrainians' counter attacks have been much stronger than they had anticipated, which I think is a really good thing from that perspective. That I think Russia can only continue in the war as long as they kind of have public support, right? Like, obviously there is a lot of public support for Putin as far as we know. There's so much there's such little other media coverage that people receive and so on. But I think, if a war goes on for years and years and years and doesn't get the response that, that you've been sold, then I think people will eventually start to lose faith. And if they do that, then I think Russia will have to consider pulling out of the war, or some other kind of some other kind of negotiation with Ukraine.
Go on.
So I'd just like to quickly jump in and say I'd actually disagree with that slightly. I think if you look at Russian history, certainly public support has never been much of a force in politics. It's never mattered too much. I think Putin could keep the war going as long as he maintains the confidence of elites and people around him, which I think he has done so far, certainly. But I do think he could continue to pump out his propaganda, continue to spend huge amounts of public money on it, and I think that in Russia, the people, there's no culture of sort of resistance. There's no culture of opposing the government from a sort of wider group. There's the people just don't do that. It's never happened.
I mean, apart from the Russian Revolution, but
even that, the Bolsheviks were quite a small group that managed to then seize power against multiple factions. They didn't necessarily have popular support, even though they portrayed it that way.
Well, what do you think then? You said about Putin, and what do you think about the reports from the US intelligence that Putin was treated for advanced stages of cancer? Is it the case actually it's possible we won't actually be dealing with Putin by the end of this war, but another leader, and will they be as extreme as him, or do you think actually the whole regime might collapse if Putin does die, if these reports are of course true?
I mean, I don't think it will matter too much in the sense that if he, were to die or lose power in that way, then he'd just become a martyr, and then potentially whoever follows from him would then, have public support. I mean, yes, I do think, Putin has become a real, he's effectively like a celebrity in Russia. People have supported him for so long. He's got just such I don't know, he's a character kind of like unlike other previous Russian leaders, but I do think that whoever came on following him, if he was able to maintain his image, then they'd equally sort of carry that on. I don't think it would cause too much of an issue.
Obviously I can't talk about Putin's cancer because frankly I don't know, but I'm not sure that his replacement would necessarily be any better, and I say that because there are two possibilities. First of all, Putin is sort of very ill to the point of, potential death, and is self-aware enough to create a contingency plan. In other words, to maybe choose some sort of successor. And Putin's unlikely to choose some sort of like teddy bear, right? He's probably going to choose someone who's also ruthless. Or he makes no contingency planning, dies, and then there's a sort of vacuum of power. And vacuums of power historically tend to be filled by the most ruthless. So I hate to be pessimistic, but I don't think we'd necessarily get anyone who was much better in the case that Putin died.
And of course it is the case that in Russia the other political parties in parliament, although of course we shouldn't be describing them in the same sense as in this country because they're all sort of puppets of Putin, but all the other parties, that's not all the parties I should say, but most of them in the Russian parliament are puppets of Putin, and the other ones, the other major ones like the Communists and the Liberal Democratic Party, which is name shouldn't make you believe that they are Liberal Democratic, they are actually fascists, self-described fascists. They also support the war in Ukraine. So wherever you turn, the leading politicians across the Russian spectrum that are allowed to have an opinion are in favour of the war, give or take. What do you reckon? I mentioned this in the introduction to this segment about Macron and his comments. Do you think that the West should be concerned about humiliating Putin, or should it be more of the approach that perhaps Boris Johnson is taking, that you should just keep on defending Ukraine and shouldn't accept any bad, I put that in inverted commas, bad peace deals, and just keep going until Ukraine ultimately wins? What do you think? What do you make of that?
Just real quick, like, one of the problems with this war is I just see very little room for negotiation and agreement here. I don't see anything which both Putin and Ukraine could agree on, because obviously Putin couldn't accept anything that he couldn't sell as a victory to his own people, but also how could so long as Ukraine has a fighting ability, how could they ever accept a situation in which they're making concessions to an invader? I don't see where there's a sort of centre ground with which an agreement can be made. So I understand what Macron's saying, and I understand what Boris is saying, but I just don't see where there's real room for negotiation there.
Macron's comments are amusing because they're, obviously they're within the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union and perceived humiliation in Russia, which then led to Putin and a sort of revanchism and a sort of idea of Russian renewal and restoring prestige. But it's also interesting that if you look at France and Russia and their historic relationship, they've always, for a long time, had had an alliance and worked together, certainly before the First World War. So it seems to speak to that as much as the Soviet Union, but also probably Macron's desire to have an air of independence from Anglo-American consensus in foreign policy. Whilst France is part of NATO, he and the French do like to be sort of proudly their own actor in certain ways, and they like to take a lead where they can. But I think there is some substance to it. I don't think you want to humiliate the Russians again. I think that would be foolish, but you also can't allow them to have what they want. I think you'd want to you wouldn't want to sort of toot about a victory too much. You wouldn't want to broadcast that too widely, but you would want to make it clear that it's not acceptable to take parts of another country by force.
Rebecca, do you think this sort of middle ground approach that Titus is suggesting, sort of halfway between the two approaches, trying to get a good deal for Ukraine, but once, hopefully, if Ukraine wins the war, then not to discredit Russia too much? What do you think to that?
I mean, I think there's a point to be made of not pushing a country into a corner, and yes, not like publicly humiliating it. In many ways, Russia's doing this war to sort of re-emphasize its power on the world stage. So I can completely understand where Macron's coming from. I think, no one wants to escalate this any further. If agreements can be made, then that would be a good thing. If diplomacy can, I think that's preferable. But the problem is, from the Ukrainian perspective, you can understand why that's a really insulting statement, and you can also understand that from their point of view, they don't particularly care, and maybe by humiliating Putin, that's potentially the only way that the war is going to end. I agree that you can't make a country, you don't want a country to not be functional after the war has ended, because that will only lead to further problems, and that's certainly not going to help anything in the sense of international agreements or anything like that, and the perspective of NATO. But I don't know, it's a difficult one. I think Putin either way is probably going to be humiliated out of this, so I don't think that's necessarily even something that Ukraine can control.
Very interesting, very interesting. Well, we're going to take another break in a minute, but before we do, I'd just like to say that, as you can probably hear, that my fellow co-host Thomas Gregory is absent for this week, and this could be potentially his last ever show, and he's missed it, which is a terrible shame. But I will be continuing on next year with or without him, hopefully with him if he's around in Nottingham, but we're unaware of his plans. But in honour of my co-host, I am playing a song by one of his favourite artists, Sam Fender, so enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the third and final part of The Big Picture on University Radio Nottingham. So our last topic of today is the cost of living crisis, which has been extended by the Ukraine crisis, but existed beforehand. Apologies for my not finding my words there. I'm full of hay fever. So the cost of living crisis. The government were not going to do a windfall tax. They're now doing I think they're calling it a temporary profit levy, which is basically a windfall tax. And they are now giving £650, I believe, to help. I think that's going to be in the autumn, certain families, if they reach the threshold. It's very interesting economically speaking in terms of the dynamics of the political parties, because you have a situation here where Rachel Reeves is attacking, that's the Shadow Chancellor for Labour, attacking the Conservatives for their economic policies, and John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Chancellor, who's on the very left of the Labour Party, is defending Rishi Sunak against Rachel Reeves. So we are in a very interesting time. What do you make of what the government's done? Do you think it's enough? And what can actually be done in the more longer term to solve this crisis, do you think? Or what do you think the Conservatives are able to do? And Daniel wants to know, what would John Major do, Titus?
Well, to start with that, I think that John Major would most likely be sitting in the Cabinet Office accepting multiple ministerial resignations over this crisis. I don't think he would use a windfall tax to put money back into people's pockets. He would probably go down the route of cutting taxes or temporarily reducing things like national insurance. But it's hard to say. He probably has an opinion and has spoken on this, so I'd probably defer you to his Twitter account or whatever channel he uses to communicate with the public these days. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think it's kind of interesting actually how people are taking different approaches. Different, like, I mean, the cost of living crisis, I think, has been in many ways not. I actually don't know what you guys think of like the coverage and things of the cost of living crisis. I think there was a lot of coverage initially about it, but it's kind of, I've seen a lot less of it. I think the thing is with like the confidence vote and things like that, that's kind of like taken over a lot of the journalistic coverage that I've seen. But I mean, I think it's going to be a massive problem for the Conservative Party. I think this is something where Labour really should have come in stronger and not, had people sort of supporting or sympathising with the Conservative approach. It seems like a really obvious thing to say, this is really unacceptable. These are the kind of things that we would introduce. There's a really obvious opposition here, and it just hasn't really been fulfilled. So I think Labour have sort of missed the mark a bit here.
Yeah. It does feel like a bit of an own goal, doesn't it?
Well, what can Labour do now? I mean, being in opposition is very difficult. But when you've got, you suggest to the government a windfall tax, and then they do it, what do you then say? Like, should Labour move more extreme, or do they now criticise the government from the right? I mean, they've been making a lot of points about inflation, about how taxes are very high. I think it's the case that 45% of the cost of petrol when you get your fuel for your car is tax in some form, and this is the Conservative Party, which is where taxes seem to be the highest since the initial post-war period where we were still in rationing. So is it the case that the Conservatives parking their tanks on Labour's lawn has really put Labour in a very difficult position?
I think, first of all, it's been the whole windfall tax, or whatever it is the Conservatives are calling it, I think it's been very interestingly timed around the Sue Gray report. I think it may have been in the works for quite a long time. But I think from Labour's perspective, I think it may not even be in their best interest to criticise the government regarding the windfall tax. Instead, just make it clear that it was your idea to begin with, and to say that, okay, it's good that the Conservatives are accepting our ideas. Here are some even more good ideas that we have, Accept it almost as like, obviously you should be critical of the government in general, especially with regards to the broader cost of living crisis. But with regards to the windfall tax, just kind of own it a little bit,
And I think they could have also then made it clear that it was their idea, and then go, okay, this was our idea, maybe we should be in government because we're the ones who suggested it, and they clearly think that we're right. And also we'd be swifter to implement it. So I think they did that with a couple of other ideas the government U-turned on in the pandemic. But I think it does seem peculiar to be criticising them from a perspective of they should be taxing less or spending less. That certainly isn't traditional sort of left-wing politics, but they haven't gone that way, especially when they initially criticised the government for not doing enough. So it does seem that they're making a bit of a fumble of this one when they could have made it portrayed it as a situation where they had the right answer and the government have accepted that, and so then this government is a mess, chaotic, incompetent. They're looking to us for ideas. We should now be the ruling party. That's what I think would have been the best path.
The windfall tax that the government were previously saying was not possible because it would deter investment into the country, and now they're doing it. So are the government, or of course they're not calling it the windfall tax, but is this going to deter investment, do you think?
I mean, maybe. I think that's a really it's quite an easy argument to make of anything like a windfall tax, but I actually don't think that it should put off people too much. It's not an unreasonable tax, and particularly we've seen things like energy companies making a ridiculous amount of profit. So I think no, it shouldn't put businesses off, and also there's been more of an emphasis on like domestic businesses and stuff since Brexit anyway. So I think it should be fine.
Yeah, I think these big oil's been making like super normal profits for quite a few months now. So yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't think companies will be unable to not have all of that additional money. I think it probably hurt these businesses more if people don't have money in their pockets. Like if people can't afford sort of the basic standard of living. I think that would hurt these companies far more than not having, all this additional money.
Do you think that the Conservative Party has lost their sort of one of the biggest things that people vote for them on, which is economics? It's always been often the case, even when the Labour Party get into office, that the Conservative Party is still seen as the party of economics. But we're in a situation where in the G7, the United Kingdom is going to have, I think, not this year, but the following year, and maybe the year after that, the slowest growth. And also opinion polls seem to indicate that the population now trusts Labour more on the economy than the Conservatives. Do you think the Conservatives have lost this sense that they are the economic competent party, and that maybe people might think that Labour might manage their finances better, which is unusual for the public to think?
I think that is correct. Not only have they've clearly turned their back on neoliberalism in practice, they also seem to have sort of disregarded an idea of responsible management, which is obviously a sort of conservative ideal before neoliberalism. So they haven't held to those two maxims. But what I think what they ought to have done is maybe increased, or maintain their increase of universal credit instead of having an extraordinary payout as a one-off to people. I think that if they had managed or helped to support those who are in the most difficult financial situations in our country earlier, then they would probably be in a slightly less perilous situation now. And I think having a one-off payout that is much more significant is likely to make the inflation that we're experiencing worse. So I do think that they have managed this poorly. But I think that there is a potential for justification of the tax on the energy companies, but I don't think it shouldn't be a Conservative instinct. They shouldn't be looking to do that, and I certainly don't think they should be U-turning on a decision like that. They should have a clear policy.
I think this kind of goes back to the whole thing about how the Conservative Party, as of late, is constantly dealing with scandals also. I think there just doesn't seem to be a great deal of long-term planning and thinking. It seems to me at least that the implementation of the windfall tax, what was it, like 1 or 2 days after the Sue Gray report was released? It seems to be an incredibly political move, especially during this time. Making political decisions about the economy just seems to be incredibly dangerous to me.
I agree that I think it was probably a political decision about the windfall tax to a certain extent, but I don't think that they shouldn't have done that. I think actually that probably, I don't think it's going to benefit their image particularly, but I think you can't just allow the cost of living crisis to go on as it is. I think that's going to damage their reputation potentially even more. So I think there's been some good decisions that the Conservative Party have made, but I think the problem is it's either taken them too long, or there's just been too much public outcry about the current economic situation. It's just kind of overlooked any of the potentially good decisions that have been made.
I do think though that if you do bring out a £650 payout, then after, when that goes, there is then a drop off. People who previously had money are then going to have to deal with less. It doesn't sort of tackle the underlying problem, and it doesn't seem sustainable. I think if they had, when they increased universal credit, if they had kept that, it would have been a show of sort of care, of support for those who are like I said, in the most difficult financial situations, and they wouldn't then have to inject huge amounts of money in a short period of time to the economy, potentially making inflation worse, and then also putting those people in an awkward situation where they're then going to have less money later, but still deal with similar prices.
Well, thank you very much, Titus. And by the way, earlier, I think it's Daniel that said this. He says, "Good answer, Titus, to the John Major question that he submitted." Well, this has been the big picture. It's been a very enjoyable year as my first year as host with Thomas, and we've had a thank you from I'm not sure who, but one of our lovely listeners who says, "Thank you so much for the amazing show, Felix and Thomas." Well, thank you very much for listening, because we wouldn't have a radio show without our regular listeners, all 10 of you, if even at a push. But thank you very much for tuning in. And we'll be back in the autumn. So thank you to Rebecca and to Aaron and to Titus.
Thank you very much.
Felix. Thank you very much. I've been Felix Hawes, and this has been The Big Picture on University Radio Nottingham. And to close, we will have one of the greatest songs by one of the greatest bands that have ever existed, Never Forget by Take That. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in autumn.